Leader of the Opposition and Leader of the People's National Movement and Member of Parliament for Arima, the Honourable Penelope Beckles Robinson, Senator Dr. the Honourable Amory Brown, Leader of Opposition Business in the Senate, the Honourable Marvin Gonzalez, Member of Parliament for Rukalopino and Leader of Opposition Business in the House, Senator the Honourable Vishnu Dan Paul, ladies and gentlemen, members of the media, those locked on virtually, we welcome you to another opposition press conference here from the Leader of the Opposition's office in Port of Spain. Once again, there are quite a few matters that have come to the fore that we as the opposition of Trinidad and Tobago need to address head on, and we thank you for tuning in and being part of yet another one of these pressers. So today we are actually going to begin with some matters that will be addressed by the Honourable Marvin Gonzalez. So again, we thank you and we welcome MP Gonzalez to the microphone.
Thank you very much, Hans. Good morning, Trinidad and Tobago, members of the media. Good morning to my colleagues, the Leader of the Opposition, my colleague from the Senate, Leader of Opposition Business in the Senate, as well as Senator Vishnu Dan Paul. Ladies and gentlemen, I am here to briefly respond on behalf of the PNM and the opposition with respect to recent statements attributed to the Minister of Homeland Security with respect to the upsurge in crime, the upsurge in murders in Trinidad and Tobago, and the apparent inability of the minister and the government to truthfully account to the people of Trinidad and Tobago with respect to how it plans to address this very troubling development as it relates to crime and criminality in Trinidad and Tobago. The minister, in a recent interview with the media, blamed the opposition, and I quote from an article by Shane Superville, where the minister was said, and I quote, "I am in no way satisfied," talking about the crime situation in Trinidad and Tobago. "I am in no way satisfied, but I know the police service are doing their best," he said, end quote. He said, noting budget constraints inherited from previous administration, he criticized the opposition for not supporting the Zozo bill in Parliament. The minister continues. Alexander said that Zozo is designed not only to prevent violence, but also to provide social support, including educational and employment assistance to communities that otherwise have limited access to such services. And I end my quotation on that report. So according to the minister, it is only under a Zozo type regime that communities will have access to social support, educational and employment assistance that have been otherwise been limited to such services. And I want to ask the people of Tunapuna, because in addition to Minister Alexander being responsible for Homeland Security and national security in Trinidad and Tobago, I want to ask, he's an elected member of the House of Representatives, elected by the people of Tunapuna. And I want to ask the people of Tunapuna, if this is what you expect from your member of parliament, who is now on record in saying that the only way you, his constituents, will have access to social support, including educational and employment assistance, would be under a Zozo regime being imposed on you. I want to ask the people of Tunapuna, is that what you expect from your member of parliament? Let us now go back to the issue of the opposition being blamed for the collapse of the Zozo bill. Ladies and gentlemen, you would recall, and we would have said from this platform from time and time again, that when the Zozo bill was laid in the parliament, the opposition only had 2 or 3 days to digest this very consequential document. It was laid in the parliament on the Wednesday, and we were summoned to parliament on the Friday. And the government had the Zozo bill together with 2 critical pieces of legislation on that day. The Zozo bill was the last to be debated. The government passed 2 other pieces of legislation, the Motor Vehicles and Road Traffic Act, an amendment to the THA Act. And at 10:30 p.m. that night, debate on the Zozo bill commenced, and it went until 3:30 a.m. a Saturday morning. The government only intended to put 2 speakers on the floor. And when we in the opposition signaled to the government that given the seriousness of this bill, that all our speakers were prepared to speak, at 3:30 p.m., the Attorney General was called upon to wind up the debate. When one of our members on the opposition bench was signaling that he intended to enter into the debate. Why am I saying all of that? I'm saying all of that to suggest to you and the country that the government was not prepared to listen to the concerns of the opposition. The government was not prepared to enter into any serious dialogue. The government was not prepared to listen to the voices of the elected members of the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago on this very critical issue of a bill that was designed to undermine constitutional rights without constitutional safeguards and oversight, giving huge powers to the Defense Force, imposing curfews and cordons in communities all over Trinidad and Tobago, and giving the Prime Minister the power to declare zones, to declare cordons, and to declare states of emergencies without parliamentary oversight. Can you imagine this is what they were prepared to do in Trinidad and Tobago and not prepared to listen to the voices of the opposition? Notwithstanding the fact that our members were muzzled from fully participating in the debate in the House, the government, using its majority, passed the bill. And on that bill, on its way up to the Senate, the Prime Minister was on record accusing independent senators of all manners of things. And there's no need to go into the details of that anymore. But you, citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, would recall that the Prime Minister accused independent senators of being P&M bootlickers, etc., and all manners of things. And you have to ask yourself whether the government really intended to get the support to pass this very critical piece of legislation in Trinidad and Tobago so that they can do what they expected under this bill. During the debate in the Senate, the independent senators circulated a number of amendments demonstrating their ability and demonstrating their willingness to support the government with critical amendments to improve the bill, to improve the constitutionality of the bill, to ensure that there's appropriate constitutional oversight. And the Attorney General refused all amendments, including amendments passed by the People's National Movement under Senator Brown and Senator Faris Alwari. These amendments were circulated, and we informed the government that we are prepared to work with you, but you need to take into consideration these amendments to ensure that we improve this bill. And the Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago is on record in saying that the opposition, that the government will entertain no amendment to the Zozo bill. So it leaves one to wonder whether the government intended for the Zozo bill to fail from the onset so that they can use its failure to justify its inability to solve crime and criminality in Trinidad and Tobago. I say it again. it leaves the reasonable mind to wonder whether the government intended for the failure, the deliberate failure of the Zozo bill, so that they can use this. They can use this as some excuse, and their excuse, to not contain crime and criminality in Trinidad and Tobago. I want to ask the Minister of Homeland Security, how is the Zozo bill designed, or rather going to improve policing in Trinidad and Tobago? Evidence-based policing, intelligence-led policing. How is the Zozo bill going to improve the administration of justice in Trinidad and Tobago? How is the Zozo bill going to deal with some of the constraints we have at the DPP's office? Because they are not prepared to deal with some of the critical issues that are contributing to crime and criminality in Trinidad and Tobago. They are not prepared to deal with it. And he is unprepared to deal with it. And as a matter of fact, his lowest hanging fruit and most convenient excuse right now is that for every murder that takes place in Trinidad and Tobago, every murder that takes place in Trinidad and Tobago, serious crime, blame the collapse of the Zozo bill on independent senators and the People's National Movement, and somehow the people of Trinidad and Tobago will give them a pass. It is not going to happen. Minister Alexander must come to us and come to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, because he believes that his ministerial portfolio would just involve engaging in foolishness in front of the parliament, blowing in a plastic bag, and engaging in all kinds of conduct unbecoming of a minister, not realizing that the day is going to come where he has to give an account of his ministerial accomplishment. I want to ask Minister Alexander that we've asked that in the debate in the parliament. Tell us what Zozo is going to achieve that you cannot achieve currently, because joint exercises between the police service and the defense force has been with us for a very long time. As a matter of fact, in one of the rare moments in the lower house when the minister spoke in a debate, the minister in the Zozo bill debate said that as a result of successful operation between the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service and the Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force, you have had a reduction in crime and criminality in the Port of Spain division. That was able to be accomplished within the current legislative and constitutional role and function in Trinidad and Tobago. How all of a sudden it is a problem? If you were able to achieve that within the current legislative context in Trinidad and Tobago, then tell us what is different now, why it cannot be done. If you have the track record to suggest that we have had successes in enforcing the law in difficult communities around Trinidad and Tobago, tell us now what is the problem. And I want to ask the minister, tell us why the police cannot continue to operate under the Anti-Crime Act, the Anti-Gang Act, the Anti-Terrorism Act, the Proceeds of Crime Act, the Sexual Offences Act, the Kidnapping Act, Trafficking in Persons Act, Dangerous Drug Act, the Firearms Act, the Offences Against the Persons Act, the Bail Amendment Act that we passed in 2024. I want to ask the minister, tell us what is wrong with those pieces of legislation, and come to the parliament and work with the opposition so that we can improve those pieces of legislation that the parliament passed by the elected members. And then you will demonstrate your seriousness to tackle crime and criminality in Trinidad and Tobago. Then you will be able to demonstrate to us that you can work within our current constitutional framework to tackle crime at its root causes, to address the delays in the administration of justice, to address the problems in our prison system and prison reform. All of these things require hard work. And that is what a government is elected to do. But if you are not prepared to do the hard work and address the root causes of crime and the social interventions that are necessary, then you are unfit to hold public office in Trinidad and Tobago. And I want to ask the minister, before I depart this podium, Tell us, what is the government prepared to do on the Whistleblower Protection Act that the People's National Movement passed in 2024? Was not supported by the UNC, was opposed by the UNC, but eventually passed. Tell us, the Whistleblower Protection Act, which provides for the protection for individuals who report corruption and improper conduct in both the public and private sectors. Tell us if you are prepared to assent and proclaim this act and bring it into force in Trinidad and Tobago. I also want to ask the minister to tell us whether or not you are prepared to bring into force the Miscellaneous Testing and Identification Act 2024, which mandates polygraph tests, drug tests, biometric identification for members of the protective services, members of the judiciary, members of the civil service, FIU, and all of these agencies that play a part in the fight against crime. This piece of legislation is to ensure that we have integrity by officers who join the fight on a daily basis against crime and criminality in Trinidad and Tobago. I want to ask the minister whether or not he's prepared to bring into force in Trinidad and Tobago these two key pieces of legislation, because that is what is necessary to tackle crime and criminality in Trinidad and Tobago. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much, and I will pass the podium over to MP Hans Devines.
Thank you very much, MP Marvin Gonzalez, for touching on so many things regarding national security, and particular with the ZOSO bill. One of the things that MP Gonzalez touched on was the fact that the time from knowledge of the bill and what the bill was going to have inside of it to the point where we had to actually debate it in Parliament, it was very short time. But we want to remind the public, we as the opposition of Trinidad and Tobago, we remain perspicacious and ready to deal with anything that comes up regarding governance in Trinidad and Tobago. And now to deal on some matters of finance, we welcome Senator the Honorable Vishnu Dan Paul to address you.
Thank you very much, Hans, and good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. I just quickly, very briefly, touch on 4 topics. The IMF report, the removal of Trinidad and Tobago from the EU blacklist, the bond offer on the international financial market, and just an opening statement, really, on the blueprint revitalization plan. Just about the IMF report, the minister keeps saying it's an excellent report, good report, but the report could only be good if there was a good baseline. And that is what the last PNM administration left, an excellent baseline on the economy. And just to show you how it was an excellent baseline, the IMF said that inflation and unemployment are low, the banking sector appears sound, and the private sector credit growth is robust. Let me just take you to some figures here, because I like to back up what I'm saying in figures. The economy was sound. In 2022, growth was positive 0.9%, 23, 1.5%, 24, 2.5%, and it's estimated to reach 0.8% positive in 2025. Inflation, period average, 5.8% in 2022, 4.6% in 2023, and 2024 is 0.5 and 1% estimated for 2025. And I'm quoting from the IMF document itself. And then the unemployment rate, 4.7 in 2022, 4.1 in 2023, and 5.5 in 2024. So if the minister is of the view that this is a good IMF report, then obviously he has to look at the baseline. All of these things couldn't happen in a 10-month period. Absolutely not. And then there's the final one the IMF used, the final indicator, the private sector growth. And which is an excellent indicator of confidence in the economy. But private sector growth from 2014 to 2025 grew to $89.6 billion, an all-time high. And private sector growth is really your mortgages, people taking on mortgages, people purchasing cars, as you can see, at that level of confidence in the economy. So just moving on quickly because I run out of time. But just to let you know that we'll be speaking on all these topics in the Parliament shortly, in the Senate shortly. So what are the negatives? The IMF pointed out very weak growth. The IMF estimates the economy grew by only 0.8% in 2025. Stagnant energy sector. Stagnant production in mature energy sector has weighed on activity. A persistent foreign exchange shortage. The current account balance, meaning that's simply the difference between the export and imports in the country, remains in surplus, though the external position has weakened and foreign exchange shortages continue to impede non-energy businesses and investment. Declining reserves based on foreign exchange interventions by the central bank. And this is one I think the minister should have picked up on, and something I'm going to speak more on later. And that interest rate misalignment, which simply means that the interest rate in Trinidad, the repo rate has not changed since March 2020. And what has happened is that the interest rate in the United States picked up on the US dollar. So people are now saying, well, do I move my money out of Trinidad? Do I engage in capital flight because I'm getting a higher interest rate on the US dollar outside of Trinidad? Rising public debt requiring fiscal consolidation. And this is probably the only issue that we share with the government, exchange rate rigidity. We in the PNM, we've always said that we're not going into devaluation, and we maintain that stance. The bottom line is, the IMF paints a picture of a country slowly recovering, but not yet firing on all cylinders. Okay? And I want to say something a bit on, I don't know why it wasn't in this IMF report. No one ever seems to want to speak about the overdraft facility at the central bank. The overdraft facility at the central bank determines the fiscal policy in Trinidad and Tobago, because the overdraft facility at the central bank drives fiscal policy in Trinidad and Tobago. The exchequer account at the Treasury now stands at over $50 billion, which means that if you borrow money, that $1 billion, and I'll come to that again, that $1 billion that was just borrowed to repay a debt due, a bullet payment due in August, that $1 billion will be converted at the central bank and used to repay the overdraft facility at the bank. You cannot engage in any meaningful fiscal policy if your economy is strangled by the overdraft facility at the central bank. In fact, to be honest with you, and I know I'm not wrong, I have never heard, since he's been in office, I haven't heard the Minister of Finance discuss the overdraft facility at the central bank. It's as though he's trying to put it at the back burner, but nothing can happen in the country unless you start to repay that facility. And the only way you can repay that facility at the central bank is if you run fiscal surpluses, or if you engage the country in fiscal surpluses. That being said, I just want to say a bit now, because I don't have much time, on the removal of Trinidad and Tobago from the EU tax list. The Minister of Finance was in Senate yesterday, and if you were asleep under a rock, you would think that the UNC did everything to achieve this. But just from the media release of the European Union, I just want to repeat a paragraph. This important milestone reflects several years, I repeat, several years of sustained commitment, constructive dialogue, and close cooperation between the Ministry of Finance of Trinidad and Tobago and the European Union authorities. They didn't say the last 10 months, aimed at aligning with international agreed standards for tax governance. Trinidad and Tobago took a key step to achieve this positive result in replacing its former free trade zone, remember that regime, which was found harmful, with a special economic zone which exists right now, regime that meets international standards. And then just to give former Minister of Finance, Minister Imwood, some major kudos. The Ministry, PNM released a media report last week. And it says, as part of that process, the Minister of Finance met with the assessment team on 25th October 2024 to confirm the government's full political and administrative support, and then proceeded to Paris the following week to continue the high-level engagement needed to protect Trinidad and Tobago's standing. We are not speaking about the last 10 months. And just again, I have to move on very quickly. The bond issue. The minister is speaking about this 2 times oversubscribed bond issue. That's absolute rubbish. Because in 2014, under a UNC government, under former Minister Hawaii, now Governor Hawaii, the government went to the market with a 550 bond issue. That was 11 times oversubscribed at 4.5%. This is a 6.5% coupon rate and only 2 times oversubscribed. And he said it's been 2 times oversubscribed because people are convinced about the economy, people are convinced about how well the country is doing. Absolute rubbish. It should have been close to 10 times oversubscribed. Similarly, in 2016, former Minister Imwood approached the market for $1 billion at and he got it at 4.5%. And it was 3 times oversubscribed in 2016. So I just want to put a stop to that nonsense that the Minister of Finance is speaking about the oversubscription of this bond. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to say a bit about this revitalization plan of the government. A little known fact about Trinidad and Tobago, a little discussed fact about Trinidad and Tobago, is that Trinidad and Tobago is the only small island energy exporting, energy producing democracy in the world. And you can Google it. It's the only small island energy exporting, energy producing democracy in the world. So if this government choose to use the Arab model, the United Arab Emirates model, or the Bahrain model, as a comparison, the operative word that we have going for us is democracy. What could work in Bahrain and United Arab Emirates, right, as energy producers, cannot work in Trinidad. We are bound by procurement legislation. It's not a case where in Bahrain I could give someone to work on a road or a bridge or anything like that. This is a democracy. Okay? And that is something I think the population needs to understand. The differences, that major difference in the model that they're using and the model that exists in Trinidad right now. So those brief words, ladies and gentlemen, I am prepared to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Dan Paul. Once again, just a reminder, we will address all questions after all of our speakers have finished updating you and dealing with the matters at hand. Now, as we look to some issues affecting foreign affairs and naturally CARICOM, we now welcome Senator Dr. the Honorable Amory Brown.
Thank you very much, MP Hans Devines, as usual, doing yeoman service at these media conferences. I recognize the Honorable Leader of the Opposition and political leader of the People's National Movement, Chief Whip, MP Marvin Gonzalez, and my fellow Senator Vishnu Danpal. Ladies and gentlemen of the media, well, let's get right into it. We stand in the aftermath of a very unusual presentation made by the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago to the 50th Conference of Heads of Government of CARICOM at the opening ceremony yesterday. Now, I saw it being billed by a few UNC activists as a feature address. But first of all, this was not a feature address. This is a normal routine at such meetings where newly elected heads of government are given the opportunity to present remarks. So that's all that it was, and you would know that the Prime Minister absented herself from that first opportunity, which would have been in Kingston, Jamaica. So she was given a second chance on this occasion. Yeah, so just to clarify that. But let's talk a little bit about that speech, which I was pleased that many people in the country would have paid attention to. And in fact, from the remarks I've seen online, people in the diaspora and across the region paid attention to this speech. I think there was some anticipation based on all of the reckless rhetoric of the Prime Minister in the last 10 months or so toward CARICOM. Well, many persons were left with a deep sense of shame. The Prime Minister was incoherent. She was disorganized, at times rambling considerably. And the remarks that she presented compared very poorly to everything else that was delivered on that CARICOM stage. There were other remarks by Prime Minister Holness of Jamaica, which were very measured and in keeping with regional diplomacy. The same applies to Prime Minister Drew, the host Prime Minister Friday of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and the President of Suriname. So Trinidad and Tobago stood out like a sore thumb on this occasion. And the Prime Minister seemed genuinely unprepared and unfit for this particular delivery. Just at the start, when she arrived, she seemed to have confused the fact that this was not the 50th anniversary of CARICOM. She referred to the occasion as such. In fact, the 50th anniversary of CARICOM was celebrated right here in Trinidad and Tobago in 2023. And this same Kamla Persad-Bissessar, as leader of the opposition then, opposed the hosting of the 50th anniversary celebration. So she went there confused about that. What actually it was is the 50th Conference of Heads taking place on the 53rd anniversary of CARICOM. The contents of the speech. The Prime Minister offered no vision for our regional family, offered no solution to any of the challenges facing CARICOM. It was a rambling discourse focused on a number of domestic and foreign talking points, some of which would have been familiar to the audience. And right after she spoke, there was a Calypso finale, which was very interesting. And this was a performance by the 6-time Calypso monarch of St. Kitts and Nevis, who's not just their most successful Calypsonian, but he also happens to be a cabinet minister of that country. He's the Minister of Public Infrastructure, Utilities, Transport, Information, Communication, and Technology. He gave a very unusual Calypso performance where he literally stood in front of the Prime Minister and accused her and her delegation of hypocrisy in their references to Cuba. And I will speak a little bit more about that, the hypocrisy of this Prime Minister with respect to Cuba. This is not the first time our country has been represented on a CARICOM stage. Traditionally, across administrations, we've been able to be proud and associate ourselves with the delivery and the content. Trinidad and Tobago normally punches above its weight class and represents all the citizens of our country with distinction. That did not occur in this case. Our country has always been embraced as a leader, and now we are derided and looked down upon by many as a poor example within this regional family. I saw a few lines trying to compare the Prime Minister's speech with the other speeches that were delivered. I would say it compared extremely poorly. Even on the issue of protocol, even on the issue of salutations, this is a very formal occasion. The Prime Minister could not bring it within herself in her salutations to refer to the Secretary General of the Caribbean Community, who was sitting right in front of her, clearly carrying some kind of personal grouse, which she addressed eventually during her remarks. Those are errors or transgressions that are unforgivable at this level. So the basic salutations, she mangled and demonstrated disrespect to the Secretary General of CARICOM. And then during the speech, cried crocodile tears about not getting a reply to one letter. You have a video. I'm being told there's a video to share.
Right. Tell the Cuban people, okay, we feel sorry for you. It can't work. And as you said, Prime Minister Holness, we have to find a mechanism for the humanitarian efforts of the people of Cuba. But at the same time, we cannot, and I will not, Trinidad and Tobago will not support a dictatorship in Cuba or anywhere else. We will not support it.
A few moments later.
But when Sonny Magnate is on, they set his double standards. It's like a choir who ain't singing the same song. Confusion, like when Trinidad and China hugging up and eating dinner. Yet it's pressure for Lil Cuba just to make up a $1. And to some, they have to run. But on others, we hammer them. What the hell you expect when one thing goes for one, but not for everyone? They say, oh, how I just love. But when we can sing one song.
Well, there you go. Thank you very much, media team, for that clip. I was talking about the Prime Minister's crocodile tears, referring to the CARICOM Secretariat and complaining very inappropriately at that forum that she did not get a reply to a letter that she had sent while she was leader of the opposition. This is hypocrisy at the highest level, or maybe the lowest level, because week after week, we, the current opposition, cannot get responses to our genuine questions and motions and approaches right here in the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago, where the government abuses its majority routinely and repeatedly. And they shut down many attempts to gain information on behalf of the people of this country. So they're conducting themselves like this here at home and then going up to St. Kitts and complaining about a letter from several years ago. So it really was a gargantuan example of hypocrisy. And then minister after minister and ministry after ministry being compelled to put out these cookie cutter statements late at night, the poor public servants, some of them drafting and typing up this foolishness on government letterheads, praising the speech or their leader was so wonderful, The bad news for the government, this has not changed the narrative and the perception of citizens who have ears of their own and eyes of their own, and who, generally speaking, were completely embarrassed and ashamed by what the Prime Minister had to deliver. Few observations, again attacking the zone of peace. It's as if she's addicted to a misinterpretation of that particular concept. Confusing a zone of peace with domestic crime circumstances. The two are unrelated. Once again, the zone of peace, as every leader who sat there listening to her shaking her head knows, treats with how leaders within our region interact with each other and how sovereign states interact with each other in the absence of hostility, military threats, and aggression. That's what the zone of peace is. It has nothing to do with your domestic circumstances with respect to crime. The Prime Minister went further and denigrated the approach, the public health approach to violent crime. She referred to it as a gimmick. Not acknowledging that a number of countries that we do business very closely with treat with crime as a public health issue as their official public policy. I can give you some examples. Sweden, Brazil, Australia, Kenya, and guess what? The United States of America. So maybe when she was harvesting her talking points, she neglected to acknowledge that even in the United States of America, violent crime and gun crime are considered as serious public health issues and emergencies. Let's get on to the issue of the sovereignty of Cuba during this particular media conference. The Prime Minister, in a most unusual fashion for Trinidad and Tobago, attacked the sovereignty of Cuba and basically presented a narrative that they must only get food and fuel when they have free and fair elections, and went on a rant reminiscent of the 1980s rhetoric about communism versus capitalism. I think that's how she described it. Really dinosaur rhetoric in today's world, demonstrating scant regard for the UN Charter and scant recognition that in a modern democracy, you get to choose your own leaders within a country, you get to choose your own system of governance and administration. You don't get to choose that of other sovereign nations. Do I need to repeat that? These are basic elements of international law and diplomacy. And the Prime Minister stood on that stage and dragged the flag, embarrassed this country. Not to mention that many of the countries that we currently do business with have very different political systems. Some of them do not have what she labeled as free and fair multi-party elections. So lecturing and hectoring the people of Cuba, who are literally under siege today, being starved of food and fuel on that basis, when at the same time praising the Saudis, the UAE, the Chinese, and all others, is monumental hypocrisy. And I'm not here criticizing those states. I'm criticizing the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago for her inconsistency and her incompetence in representing this country. Calling for food and fuel not to be permitted into Cuba, talking about dictatorship and communism. And it's a very serious circumstance facing the people in Havana and on that island. The electricity grid has basically collapsed. Without fuel, they're a very self-sustaining country, but fuel is a basic element for all manufacturing, their medical system, the education system, everything else is at stake. Their very lives and the ability to feed themselves is at stake. So this blasé 1980s rhetoric is really disrespecting of human life. And what is the difference between the attack on fuel and the energy grid in Cuba and what's happening in Ukraine with the attacks by Russia on the energy grid of the Ukrainians during the winter period? There are parallels that we have to address. There are parallels that we have to address. Cuba has assisted this country, the Caribbean region, and developing countries around the world for decades, since before I was born and many others in this room were born. Cuba has been doing that consistently, and they're doing that today, even under embargo conditions. I want to remind this Prime Minister and the national community, after the 9/11 attacks in the United States, many of the firefighters and first responders in New York and emergency technicians fell gravely ill with serious respiratory and systemic manifestations. Do you know where many of them went to for free treatment? It wasn't to Europe. It was to Havana, treated by the same Cuban experts using their technologies and their resilience. So Cuba has even assisted the very United States of America that the Prime Minister referred frequently to during her address. Just a cap off that point, unilateral coercive measures against a sovereign state are against international law. I repeat that for the benefit of the senior counsel who spoke to the Caribbean yesterday evening from a platform in St. Kitts. Unilateral coercive measures against a sovereign state are against international law. That's as simply as it can be put. And then they talk about dictatorship and autocracy, etc. This is the same Prime Minister who canceled independence celebrations for very narrow political reasons. This is the same Prime Minister the last time around that threw thousands of citizens without charge into trucks and put them in detention, costing this country millions of dollars. Those were her actions. This is the same Prime Minister that presided over a carnival where there was muting of microphones and other levels of censorship in judging, etc. That's what has happened. That's the current record. It's a good thing our friend in St. Kitts wasn't muted in his song yesterday. I guess the power was not available for the muting on that particular occasion. This is the same Prime Minister that has fired tens of thousands of people based on perceptions of who they are and their political support. Those are elements more connected to autocracy and dictatorship than some of the things that she was talking about. And as my brother Marvin said a short while ago, this is the Prime Minister that seems to offer as her only solution to crime in this country the removal of constitutional rights of some citizens of her country. Those are not elements of democracy. Those are elements of autocracy. I can go on and on, but I won't. Citizenship law, we sat in Parliament. They came with this narrative. Let's save our sports teams. Let's try to qualify for this and that. This is to boost our performances on the field. Look at who's being approved for citizenship under this law. People with very little connection to Trinidad and Tobago. Be warned. So a lot of those tears and lamentations on that stage were crocodile tears, and the accusations of hypocrisy directed at CARICOM. Well, one finger pointed at CARICOM, many fingers of the Prime Minister were pointing back at herself. She's the only one in this region still parroting this talk about narco-terrorism and so on, when the very perpetrators themselves, the Armada is gone, and there is a sense of finality. The oil arrangements are being finalized. Life is moving on. Otherwise, the Prime Minister is stuck with that narrative. And if you look at the reaction of her fellow leaders in that audience in St. Kitts, it speaks volumes about how this nation is currently being regarded in the Caribbean community. It speaks volumes, not to mention the lack of applause from her fellow heads of government. So there we have it. A very, very disappointing address coming on the heels of her address at the United Nations, which was very, very poor, where I think she gave a signal, because for the first time there, You had a national statement of this country without any reference to Cuba. Every single time we've spoken at that forum, Trinidad and Tobago, whether it's Keith Rowley, whether it's Basdio Pandey, whether it's Eric Williams, every time there's been a call for the lifting of the unilateral embargo against Cuba. Last year, Kamla Persad-Bissessar was silent on the issue. She's now taken the next step in her hypocrisy, which is to cheerlead for the starvation, the siege of the Cuban people. I will end at this point and look forward to questions at the conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Brown, for highlighting the hypocritical, autocratic, dictatorial nature of the Prime Minister's speech. Up next, we welcome the next Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, our opposition leader, Member of Parliament for Rima, the Honorable Penelope Beckles-Robinson.
Thank you very much, Hans, the Honorable Member of Parliament for Diego Martin West. And let me, of course, acknowledge my colleagues, the Leader of Opposition Business in the Senate, Dr. Amy Brown, Chief Whip, the Honorable Marvin Gonzalez, and Senator Vishnu Danforth. I'm really just going to deal with three matters very briefly. And I want to start by expressing solidarity to the people of Tobago in relation to the Seabridge issue that still exists. And it's important for us to remember that. I looked at The Guardian today and I saw an article. Minister John says MV Blue Wave Harmony not the cause of Tobago goods shortage. So if the MV Blue Wave Harmony is not the cause, the people of Tobago want to know exactly what is the cause. Because it cannot be a simple situation where the minister indicates that Minister Works and Infrastructure, Gillian John, has clarified that any current shortage of goods in Tobago is unrelated to the MV Blue Harmony. The minister went on to say that if there is a shortage, it means there need to be more suppliers in Tobago. But the said Guardian article went on to explain that in speaking to Mr. Singh at Singh's Hardware, he indicated that 18 pallets of cement arrived on the ferry at 8 a.m. and by 10:30 a.m. had already been sold. What is important, he explains that there is an issue where the Cabo Star previously arrived around 8 p.m. and departed 3 hours later. The new vessel docks around 8 a.m. and leaves at 10 p.m. during peak business hours. And the article explains the challenges, the increase in cost. Reference is also made to the TT Chamber of Industry and Commerce on Friday, warned that the economic impact of the disrupted Seabridge, citing rising operational costs and the pressure on businesses to maintain prices. The truth is, whether this government accepts it or not, there is a problem. The people in Tobago are complaining, and it is their responsibility to fix that problem. We do recall that some years ago when there was an issue, the Honorable Prime Minister at the time, Dr. Keith Christopher Rowley, went before a joint select committee because there have been problems in the past, and he made himself available to address the issues and to ensure that these matters would be properly addressed. We are asking the government to address this matter urgently, and don't just simply say that there isn't a problem or to say that the problem is one of supply. The other matter that I wish to address has to do with the national recruitment drive, and to make it abundantly clear that from where we sit, it has and continues to be a publicity stunt. This government indicated in October of 2025, and they promised 20,000 jobs. During the election campaign, they promised 50,000 jobs. And what has happened? If you recall, in the budget debate in the parliament, we made it abundantly clear that there was no funds allocated in the budget for this supposed 20,000 jobs that they kept speaking about and telling the public. And you would recall that a number of us during the committee stage asked questions about where the funds were in the various ministries, and they couldn't tell you where the funds were. But further to that, if you look in the websites or if you look at several jobs being advertised, they are actually existing jobs where there are already bodies in those jobs. And therefore, we want to make it very clear that position exchange is not job creation. And also to the public that job interviews is not employment. So here it is. And if you recall the Honorable Prime Minister and several members of cabinet boasting about the 100,000 people and the thousands of people that showed up in Central, I want the government to say to the public today how many people have been employed, because as far as we know, it's only 1,800 people. But I want to read for you some comments from the Honorable Prime Minister. PM praises job recruitment drive and end to CPEP and URP. These jobs are sustainable. You could not go with a CPEP job to the bank and get a proper mortgage to buy a house. That may be so. But the fact is that thousands of people who had CPEP jobs and URP jobs, their income allowed them to pay their bills, in some instances pay a small mortgage, ensure that your children could go to school, you could go to the market. And further to that, the Prime Minister went on to say, you couldn't do it with a CPEP and URP. That was just hand-to-mouth feeding. That is a kind of slavery. That is how I saw it. And I was determined not to put people through that kind of slavery. And some members of my cabinet fought me. But we did this, and this will work. So you are saying that CPEP and URP is slavery. You are saying to the people who you fired that you were going to give them something else. You're going to give them something sustainable. But that same hand-to-mouth feeding that you spoke about, where you send those thousands of people home, today they don't have a cent. And many of them are not able to go to the market. They're not able to go to the grocery. They are not able to send their children to school. You would recall in the budget debate, we made it abundantly clear, and we made reference to the fact that the budget was fake and fraudulent. And why was it fake and fraudulent? Because they made all these false promises. Remember, promises made, promises delivered. All the thousands of CPEP workers that they call slaves, doing slavery jobs and hand-to-mouth jobs, today they are not working. And we are calling on the government to take responsibility for the statements that they made, to ensure that the thousands of people who are not employed and not working, that the jobs that you promised during your campaign, that you ensure that the people of Trinidad and Tobago are working. The last matter that I want to address has to do with the creation of Landmark TT Properties Limited. And you can go to the election and boundaries returns, and you will find out that two of those members on the board are sub-agents of the now Minister of Land and Legal Affairs. But more importantly, we need to ask ourselves, let's ask some questions. What is happening to the Ministry of Housing? What is the responsibility of the Ministry of Housing now that you have created this Landmark TT Properties, which is a new state enterprise, and that falls under the Ministry of Land and Legal Affairs, responsible for state-private housing and initiative to deal with underutilized state lands. So let us look at the facts. There is a situation in Trinidad and Tobago where more than 100,000 persons have applied for housing. And they have indicated that this new initiative creates competing interests. Or let me say, I am saying that this new initiative would create competing interests between the Ministry of Land and Legal Affairs and the Ministry of Housing. Now, let us remember, the Ministry of Housing has 3 ministers, but yet still, you move this project, or let us say you design a new project, and this project is now under the Ministry of Land and Legal Affairs. Let me share with you what the United National Congress stated in their manifesto about housing. And what did they tell the public? They told the public, and I'm reading from page 70 of the manifesto. In Trinidad and Tobago, high property prices and limited financing make home ownership difficult. The UNC aims to transform this by providing affordable housing as a foundation for stable communities and economic growth. The UNC will launch an ambitious plan to build 20,000 affordable homes in 2 years through public-private partnerships and innovative building technologies to ensure rapid and efficient construction. They talked about land for the landless. So my question is, where did this project come from? Because it is not in the manifesto. This is something very new, and it is not something that is going to be in the Ministry of Housing, where they have 3 ministers. But further to that, the HDC we know is set up for state housing delivery, land development, public-private partnership, and this new project is actually going to deal with middle to upper income earners. So they must tell us, and they must publish the full mandate of this landmark TT Properties. They must tell us exactly what is the objective, what is the criteria for the companies or organizations that will benefit from the state land. They must also publish the criteria for the beneficiaries of this project, and it must be a transparent exercise. And they must also tell us what is the operational cost of setting up of this landmark TT Properties. You would recall that on 2 occasions, the chairman of Housing, of the Ministry of Housing, made statements on 2 occasions. And when the Honorable Minister was asked about it, he said he knew absolutely nothing. Interestingly enough, this same person that came to the public with these 2 statements that the minister knew nothing about is now the minister of the landmark TT Properties. And this board that has been established, that this individual chairs, will now be under the Ministry of Land and Legal Affairs. So it must have been that there is clearly something that we do not know that is going on in the Ministry of Housing, that the Prime Minister and the Cabinet decided to create a totally new company to deal with housing and land, and now put it under another ministry. And you would also recall that during the budget debate, the same fake and fraudulent budget, that there was a reduction in the allocation to the Ministry of Housing. And you would also remember that the Honorable Geraldine John indicated that they would be distributing some 500 houses per week, because that is what this government would be involved in as it relates to construction of houses. I want to ask this government, they have now been 10 months in office. I want them to tell the public how many houses have they constructed to date?
3 ministers.
With 3 ministers. You have 3 ministers. Tell us, How many houses have you constructed? What plans do you have for the construction of those houses? So the 100,000 plus persons who have been waiting, and no doubt all of us here who are MPs, and they're coming daily and going to the Ministry of Housing, they're now telling them you have to reapply. They can't find the file. They can't find the information. We wait to find out more information as it relates to this company. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leader. We will now have questions from members of the media present. We will have our microphone being passed around. Please identify yourself and what particular media house you represent when asking your question, and which one of the members of Parliament that are here with us today you would like to address your question. Jesse Ramdev.
Testing for the good morning, everyone. This question will be directly for the opposition leader.
Yes, sir.
Ma'am, I know that Senator Brown would have already articulated his position on the Prime Minister's statement as it pertains to CARICOM, right? I know you would have also subsequently issued a statement, but for the benefit of the viewing and listening public, can you just share with us, your position, your take on the Prime Minister's statements, and also perhaps expand a bit more on the PNM's position on the matters facing Cuba from your position?
Okay, well, I mean, it's, as you notice, Senator Brown was very detailed, and my statement as well, so that there isn't anything that he has said that I disagree with. What I would say is that, I was quite taken aback, I was quite surprised, and to a large extent I was quite embarrassed, because I really could not believe that following what has transpired in the last 10 months as it relates to Venezuela, as it relates to CARICOM, I am sure every Trinidadian and Tobagonian was looking forward to a statement by the Prime Minister that would demonstrate some iota as it relates to unity, something that you would say, because we have discussed it over and over. I've been here, we are talking about the whole issue of, the trading that takes place between the regions, Jamaica, Guyana, Barbados, and the fact that there's a positive trade export, particularly as it relates to Trinidad and those regions. And interestingly enough, the entire region was looking forward to this CARICOM meeting, and they were really looking forward to hear what Trinidad and Tobago had to say. It's also unfortunate that the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago used the opportunity really to show Trinidad and Tobago in a very, very negative light. I've served as an ambassador, so too has Senator Dan Paul, so too has Senator Brown. And one of the things you look forward to, because I have had opportunities to speak at the United Nations, if the Prime Minister isn't there to represent him and all of us, that you look forward to that opportunity to say something positive about your country. Not only that, Trinidad and Tobago is viewed as a leader in the CARICOM region. And leadership means that there is something positive that you're going to say, something that you're going to share with your other CARICOM brothers and sisters as to what is happening in Trinidad and Tobago that's positive. That we have been leading the way. We have been leading the way in the energy sector. We have been leading the way in culture. We have been leading the way in business. We have been leading the way in education. And we know to a large extent that there are times when you will have challenges, you will have conflicts, but they are dealt with at a different time. When you have an opportunity to make a statement as a leader in the context of what has happened with the persons, our Trinidadians that died, the recent incidents, and several things that were said about CARICOM, we as a country, we look forward to that. And even, I would say to you, when you are in opposition, your Prime Minister's statement is something that you look forward to. Unfortunately, the Prime Minister sought to use this opportunity to talk about crime, and to talk about kidnapping. People listening to this would probably wonder what is going on in Trinidad and Tobago that a Prime Minister on such an important occasion, can say absolutely nothing positive about our country.
Ma'am, the Jamaican Prime Minister would have warned that the looming humanitarian crisis in Cuba, driven by, of course, the intensified embargoes, could destabilize the wider Caribbean. Is that a position that you share as well in terms of migration policies, economic or security spillovers? Is this something that you share?
Well, we have always maintained a relationship with Cuba. We have always been very clear as it relates to the embargo, how we voted the United Nations. We have been very consistent. And in terms of where Cuba is located, I mean, you know, Jamaica, the other islands, Haiti, really just right there, right around there. We understand that as it relates to oil, you know, traditionally you would have Jamaica, you know, providing oil. That has stopped with the, you know, the position taken by United States as it relates to tariff. We heard a statement being put out by Russia as it relates to their position and the possibility of providing oil. So the answer to that is yes, it is a humanitarian crisis. I mean, I have had the opportunity to visit Cuba on more than one occasion, so I have a good understanding. You know, it's very fascinating. They are extremely resilient people. We know that even as it relates to natural disasters, how they have been able to treat with these situations. So it must be a concern for us, and we maintain our position that Trinidad and Tobago has been consistent in its policy in supporting Cuba on the issue of the embargo, and we are really surprised at some of the statements that the Honorable Prime Minister made.
Before I hand over, let me just bring the issue home a bit closer. You know, many Caribbean countries, territories around the world, they also benefit from the Cuban doctors and the Cuban medical mission.
Yes.
Are you perhaps concerned that given certain policies by the US, the country may now be, or the Prime Minister may now be strong-armed into perhaps halting or relinquishing that position that we have with the Cubans in terms of the medical mission?
Well, we have to await this government's position as it relates to Cuba and the relationship we have had over the years as it relates to doctors coming not only here. I mean, I don't think there's any country in the Caribbean that has not utilizes the services and the expertise of Cuban doctors. And it's not only in the Caribbean. Mind you, they have the relationship going, I mean, maybe the last 40, 50 years, going to a number of African countries where they have utilized the expertise of Cuban doctors. So we have not heard what is the position of this government as it relates to the Cuban doctors and nurses. So I am, of course, calling upon the Prime Minister to indicate what is her position as it relates to that matter.
Good morning, Kimbo Dram.
Hi,
Good,
Kimbo.
thank you, Opposition Leader. Morning, Kimbo Dram from the Express. My question was primarily for Dr. Brown, being a former Foreign Affairs Minister, but by all means, as you are there, if you want to say a few words. I think what I want to ask is, what is the opposition's take or analysis, or what you believe, what you feel might be the reasoning behind the Prime Minister's position on Cuba? Trinidad and Tobago has had a fair enough relationship with Cuba for some time. My colleague mentioned the medical benefits. We have Cuban citizens coming here sometimes. I am not entirely certain of what our trade with Cuba is in this moment, but I mean, maybe Dr. Brown can say. But why take this position with our neighbor?
Well, first of all, thank you, Leader of the Opposition. You're quite correct. There is significant contact. Culturally, Cuba has benefited even the city of Port of Spain and other areas with projects for restoration of historical buildings. We have young medical students right now in Cuba, and over the years we've benefited from significant training. And of course, this is free of charge. Cuba doesn't charge Trinidad and Tobago and other developing countries, who they support in a variety of ways. And they've done other things like assistance with responding to natural disasters, and they're very, very generous nation. I gave the example earlier about 9/11. And bear in mind, Cuba was also one of the vanguards against apartheid. People forget these things, and sometimes we are ungrateful in this world. Cuba was one of the strongest countries when some of the big countries were playing a dangerous game with South Africa. Cuba was very clear, and they've really been an example in many ways. So what is the reason for this flip-flop on the part of this version of the UNC? It's difficult to speculate, but what we do know is this is a government that's not characterized by any clear principles. So it appears to be a position of convenience, playing to a certain foreign narrative, and they've basically accepted an agenda wholesale. So where you have Trinidad and Tobago now silent on Gaza, these are things that we didn't compromise on at all, not even close, and we were respected for this. On the issue of the Cuban embargo, we never compromised. As I keep calling Basdio Pandey's name, because he was a UNC prime minister and he didn't come close to compromising on these issues, because this is Trinidad and Tobago. This is our sovereign voice. All of that has been squandered, given away. I can't even say bartered, because we're not seeing anything in return. And the problem is, and I think it was the Prime Minister of Grenada who made the point last night when asked a few questions in the aftermath. Everyone was sort of horrified at this speech. When you find, as a small country, you find yourself yoked like this to a bigger agenda, it's not fair to you and your people. Because when that agenda changes, as it might in a few years' time, where does that leave you, having abandoned your anchor and your principles? And so the next government of this country and the next prime minister will have some serious repair work to do on some of the basic elements of a foreign policy, because the Cuban people will still be there, they're not going to disappear. Vishnu referred to their resilience. They're not going to disappear. And then we have the same, we're confronting it right now with Venezuela, trying to pick up the pieces. You heard the Prime Minister talk about we're still under threat. What is she talking about from Caracas? What is she talking about? Is it that she's still persona non grata and that hasn't been officially lifted? And maybe that's the reference. What threat is she referring to? So to go to CARICOM and conduct yourself like this, I have a whole series of articles demonstrating, for example, when Fidel Castro died, Kamla Persad-Bissessar was leader of the opposition, and oh boy, you would cry in empathy the way she memorialized Fidel Castro and talked about the end of dictator Batista, and Castro became a hero for the Cuban masses and progressive people everywhere. I don't know, he still considers positively progressive people, but progressive people everywhere. He transformed the lives of his people, etc., etc. Won lots of praise. And then when she was prime minister on the last occasion, and then President Obama had thawed some relations, some connections with Cuba, the praise was emphatic and enthusiastic from the same Kamla Persad-Bissessar. She, and these are comments from the Trinidad Express in 2014, December. She recalled proudly over the last 4 years, this was in 2014, so during her term as prime minister, her government reiterated Trinidad and Tobago's long-held position, calling for an end to the strained relationship. I'm quoting, the re-establishment of diplomatic ties with Cuba and the lifting of a U.S.-imposed economic embargo on that country. In September 2014, she went to the UN and she's quoting herself, I strongly reiterate the support of Trinidad and Tobago for an end to the economic embargo against Cuba, etc., etc. And now she's not just silent on the issue of the embargo, she's cheerleading for the siege and starvation of the Cuban people. You ask, how can we explain that? Position of convenience, lack of integrity, and lack of a certain level of human decency. That's how I explain it.
Ms. Beckles, for you,
Let me just say one more thing to Kim. What is interesting is that at the UN you would have these motions every year, so you have to debate it every year, and every year over the last decades we have supported, and it doesn't mean that you're not going to have the countries coming to you, whether it's United States, those who don't support, they come to you, and so they do know your position, and you I mean, it's you discuss and you debate in decency. I mean, because they know what your position is over the years. So we have always been, in my humble view, respected, notwithstanding the fact that we would have taken a different position. But one thing is that CARICOM was always united. Yes.
Ms. Beckles, over the last several months, CARICOM has had to walk a very delicate line.
Yes.
We do have a colleague in St. Kitts at the moment, and the reports that are coming back to us based on her interviews is that leaders are taking a very judicious and measured response when asked about the Prime Minister's statement. In light of that, do you think that perhaps there can be some greater fallout or fragmentation within CARICOM because of what has happened, given the fact that there's been calls for greater unification?
I believe that every effort is still going to be made as it relates to unity. But at the same time, Trinidad and Tobago has a responsibility for an institution that is decades old. And it is very important for us. I mean, there are very few of us in this room who don't have family. I mean, my grandparents, Barbados, Grenada, so you understand the linkages. I mean, whether you talk about slavery or whether you talk about indentureship, because the point is that there were always linkages, and we understand that together as CARICOM, we are much stronger and we can negotiate better, whether it is with Europe, whether it's United States, whether it's with the Commonwealth countries, that there is strength in unity. And as a people, we do value the relationship we have had with CARICOM. I mean, I have, as I said, sat at the UN, and on each and every occasion, your ambassadors, your 14 ambassadors, on virtually every topic. I mean, you meet virtually every week, and every motion, you want to know how you're going to vote. And as a bloc voting together, that is the strength and the responsibility and the respect that we have got from many other countries in the world, knowing that very often Trinidad and Tobago is offering itself a seat at the Security Council. One of your expectations is that you're going to get your votes. Your first block is your CARICOM vote. Because when you go to speak and they have luncheons and meetings, they meet with CARICOM. Yes, they may meet with individually, but your 14 votes at the UN has always been very, very valuable. So, I mean, we certainly hope that the Prime Minister would recognize, and the government would recognize, the importance of Caribbean and CARICOM unity, notwithstanding whatever issues they may have with maybe one or two of the countries, or notwithstanding whatever pressure may be brought to bear on them. That is not unusual, that pressure. We are looking at what is happening globally as it relates to tariffs in the United States, whether it's the Commonwealth, whether it's Africa, whether it's, the setting up the President of the United States setting up his Board of Peace. But that's all part of global politics. But your strength has to be that over the years, when you establish a position based on history, based on culture, based on similarity of experience, that it is worth something, that you stand up, even when you have a different view, that you must be proud of what we have done over the years in CARICOM.
My last question, ma'am.
Sure.
Does the opposition, I don't even know if there's perhaps an avenue for it to happen,
Yes.
but is there that avenue to perhaps for the opposition to communicate its own position as it relates to alignment and democracy and what's taking place with Cuba to the CARICOM? Is there any way that, or is it perhaps an option that the opposition will consider to communicate the party's own position on these matters?
Well, I mean, they have heard we have put out a release. And, even though we are in opposition, we have been in government for decades. So that as it relates to the policy of the People's National Movement, I mean, that is very clear, going back from Eric Williams, Patrick Manning, George Chambers, Dr. Keith Rowley, the position of the party, and then when we are into government, that position has been consistent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leader. We have room for one more question. We'll take a final question from members of the media. Okay.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I thought we had one more question then. Well, with that said, we want to thank members of the media for attending this opposition press conference. We once again want to thank all of you all online for viewing and sharing your comments. And on behalf of all of the members of Parliament present, again, we thank you and we express sincere condolences to Raymond Edwards, member of the media fraternity, as well as the cultural and arts fraternity, who contributed a lot to our landscape. So once again, we thank you, have a blessed day, and thank you for being part of this press conference.